June 12, 1944. Normandy, just after dawn. Mist hangs low over the hedgerows, clinging to the earth like smoke that never quite cleared. The night's artillery has gone silent, but the ground still trembles faintly, as if remembering the weight that passed over it hours before. From a slight rise, a German Panzer officer peers through binoculars toward a narrow country road. He expects a pause, a regrouping, perhaps a single probing advance. Instead, the road keeps filling. Steel silhouettes emerge one after another, then another, then more. Olive drab hulls, white stars dulled by mud. The clatter of tracks grows into a constant grinding roar. M4 Shermans. Not one platoon, not a company, a procession. He lowers the binoculars slowly. He has seen Shermans burn before. Thin armor, high profile, predictable tactics. They were never considered a serious threat. Not like a Panther, not like a Tiger. Yet this is different. The numbers do not stop. Destroy one, and another takes its place. Destroy three, and five more appear beyond them. For the first time, a quiet realization settles in. This battle may not be decided by which tank is better, but by how many can keep coming. And that realization had been forming long before Normandy, shaped by years of belief, doctrine, and dangerous assumptions about how wars are truly won. Long before American tanks appeared on European battlefields, Germany had already convinced itself it understood armored warfare better than anyone else alive. The roots of that confidence reached back to the shattered aftermath of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of tanks, aircraft, and much of its heavy industry, but it did not strip German officers of time. During the 1920s and early 1930s, a generation of thinkers, men like Heinz Guderian, used theoretical study, foreign observation, and clandestine cooperation with the Soviet Union to rethink how modern wars could be fought. What emerged was not just a new weapon, but a system. Blitzkrieg was never about tanks alone. It was about speed, concentration, and shock. Armor would punch holes. Motorized infantry would widen them. Artillery and aircraft would suppress resistance. Commanders would move faster than their enemies could react. The tank, in German thinking, was a precision instrument, a blade, not a hammer. Early successes seemed to prove the theory flawless. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6 astonishing weeks in 1940. British forces escaped at Dunkirk not because German armor failed, but because German command hesitated. To many within the Wehrmacht, this was evidence not of luck, but of intellectual superiority. German tanks did not need to be numerous. They needed to be better used. This belief shaped everything that followed. German tank development emphasized balance and refinement. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were not brute force machines. They were designed for coordination, radio-equipped, tactically flexible, and crewed by professionals trained to fight as units rather than individuals. Optics were excellent. Crew ergonomics were carefully considered. Commanders had cupolas that allowed full battlefield awareness. German officers noticed what others did not. Tanks win battles only when crews can see, communicate, and maneuver. As a result, early war German commanders grew accustomed to qualitative advantage. When they encountered enemy tanks, French Char B-1s, British Matildas, early Soviet designs, they judged them not only by armor thickness or gun caliber, but by how they were employed. Many of those enemy tanks were formidable on paper, yet clumsy in practice. Poor radios, awkward doctrine, inexperienced crews. Germany defeated them anyway. This reinforced a dangerous conclusion. Technical superiority combined with superior leadership would always overcome numbers. By 1941, when German forces crossed into the Soviet Union, that belief was tested harder than ever before. The appearance of the T-34 shocked German engineers and field commanders alike. Its sloped armor, wide tracks, and diesel engine were objectively impressive. But even then, the German response was not panic. It was adaptation, new guns, new designs, better tactics. The lesson Germany absorbed was selective. The Soviets had built a good tank, but used it poorly at first. German skill still mattered more than enemy quantity. This mindset extended to how German intelligence assessed foreign powers. The United States, in particular, was not taken seriously as a land warfare opponent. American industry was vast, but its military experience seemed thin. Observers noted outdated doctrines, a divided approach between tanks and tank destroyers, and a perceived lack of battlefield hardness. German officers had studied British and French armor closely before the war. American designs, when they were discussed at all, were often treated as curiosities, too tall, too lightly armored, too standardized. To German generals steeped in a culture of engineering excellence, the idea that a mass-produced compromise tank could threaten a finely honed panzer force seemed almost absurd. War, as they understood it, was an art practiced by professionals, not an industrial process. But even as this confidence hardened into certainty, the nature of the war was already shifting. Germany was fighting longer campaigns over wider fronts, with mounting losses it could not easily replace. The assumptions forged in the lightning victories of 1939 and 1940 were being carried into a very different kind of conflict. And into that widening war, the United States was preparing to enter, not with a perfect tank, but with an entirely different idea of how victory should look. When the United States began preparing for large-scale ground combat, it was not thinking in terms of duels between armored elites. It was thinking in terms of logistics, shipping schedules, training pipelines, and replacement rates. America entered the Second World War with a powerful industrial base, but limited modern combat experience. Its armored doctrine was fragmented, shaped by interwar debates rather than battlefield necessity. Tanks, in American thinking, were not meant primarily to hunt other tanks. That role would belong to separate tank destroyer units. Fast, lightly armored vehicles designed to respond to enemy breakthroughs. Tanks themselves were meant to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and keep moving. This distinction mattered deeply when American designers began finalizing what would become the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was not conceived as the best tank in the world. It was conceived as the most usable tank in the world. American engineers prioritized reliability above all else. The vehicle had to run in deserts, mud, snow, and dust. It had to be repairable by mechanics with limited training. It had to be shipped across oceans, unloaded under fire, driven hundreds of miles, and kept operational with a global supply chain. Components were standardized. Engines varied by factory, but parts interchangeability was maintained. If a Sherman broke down, another could take its place, and the broken one could often be fixed quickly. In German eyes, this was mediocrity. In American planning, it was foresight. The Sherman's 75mm gun was adequate, not exceptional. Its armor was sufficient, not heavy. Its silhouette was tall, its profile obvious. But inside, crews had room to work. Radios were standard. Visibility was good. The turret traverse was powered and responsive. The tank could fire accurately on the move, a righty feature often undervalued by those focused solely on penetration figures. Most importantly, it could be built in enormous numbers. American factories did not build tanks like craftsmen. They built them like refrigerators, trucks, and locomotives. Assembly lines ran day and night. Subcontractors fed components into a vast, synchronized system. By 1942, Shermans were rolling out in numbers that stunned foreign observers. By 1943, they were appearing on multiple fronts simultaneously. The first real test came in North Africa, when American armored units met German Panzer forces in Tunisia. In late 1942 and early 1943, the results were mixed at best. At Kasserine Pass, U.S. forces were outmaneuvered and outled. Shermans were knocked out by experienced German crews operating Panzer IVs and anti-tank guns. German commanders reported exactly what they expected to find. American tanks were numerous, but crews were green. Tactics were predictable. Losses were heavy. These early encounters confirmed German assumptions. Reports circulated describing the Sherman as inferior in firepower and protection. Its tendency to catch fire when penetrated became infamous. To seasoned Panzer officers, this was proof that American industry could not compensate for battlefield skill. But those reports often missed something crucial. For every Sherman destroyed, another arrived. Units that took heavy losses were rebuilt in weeks, not months. Crews were rotated, retrained, and sent back. Supply columns followed close behind the front. Fuel shortages that crippled German operations were rarely a limiting factor for American units. While German officers evaluated the Sherman as a fighting machine, American planners evaluated it as part of a system. By the time U.S. forces landed in Sicily and then mainland Italy, improvements were already underway. Ammunition stowage was modified to reduce fires. Coordination with infantry and artillery improved. Air-ground integration tightened. The Sherman did not become invincible, but it became persistent. German commanders, meanwhile, were facing a growing contradiction. On paper, their tanks were improving. Panthers and Tigers outclassed the Sherman in gun range and frontal armor. Yet these vehicles were complex, maintenance-heavy, and produced in limited numbers. Every loss was felt. Every breakdown mattered. What the Americans were building was not a tank meant to win every duel. It was a tank meant to keep the war moving forward. And as the front widened and the tempo increased, that difference, once mocked, began to take on a weight that German generals could no longer ignore. The stage was set for judgment, not just of a machine, but of two fundamentally different philosophies of war. On paper, the comparison looked almost insulting. By 1943, German armored forces fielded vehicles that appeared decisively superior to the M4 Sherman. The Panther's long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman well beyond the range at which the American tank could reply. The Tiger's 80mm gun was lethal from even farther. German armor was thicker, better sloped, and in frontal engagements often impervious to standard Sherman ammunition. German officers noticed these figures immediately. Range, penetration, armor thickness. In these metrics, the Sherman lost. What those figures did not show was how often German tanks failed to reach the battlefield at all. Panthers suffered chronic mechanical problems in 1943 and early 1944. Final drives failed. Engines overheated. Tigers required enormous logistical support and skilled maintenance crews. A breakdown could immobilize a vehicle for days, sometimes permanently, if recovery was impossible under fire. The Sherman, by contrast, was mechanically forgiving. It could be abused. Crews could drive it hard, stop briefly for maintenance, and drive again. When hit, it was often repairable. When destroyed, it was replaceable. German assessments tended to isolate performance rather than endurance. In that isolation, the Sherman looked weak. In sustained combat, it behaved very differently. Human angle, crews, training, and survivability. German Panzer crews were professionals. Many had years of combat experience. Their gunnery was precise. Their coordination was instinctive. They trusted their machines and their commanders. American crews, especially early in the war, did not have that depth of experience. They learned under fire. Mistakes were common. Losses were heavy. Yet American training emphasized something subtle but critical: survival and recovery. Sherman crews were taught evacuation drills. Radios allowed faster coordination and quicker disengagement. Improved ammunition stowage reduced fatal fires over time. German crews, inside heavily armored but cramped vehicles, often fought to the last moment. When a Panther or Tiger was penetrated, escape was difficult. Casualties were severe. Replacement crews were harder to find. Over months of combat, this imbalance mattered. Germany lost not just tanks, but irreplaceable men. Leadership angle. Dismissal at the top. Senior German commanders expressed open contempt for American armor. In post-war memoirs and wartime correspondence, Shermans were described as crude, thin-skinned, and unsophisticated. Some officers referred to American reliance on numbers as evidence of tactical poverty. These views filtered downward. Field commanders expected to defeat Shermans tactically, and often did. But expectations shape preparation. German units planned to win engagements, not endure campaigns of attrition. The confidence was genuine. It was also incomplete. The cracks were not yet catastrophic, but they were visible to those willing to look. German tactical success increasingly failed to translate into operational advantage. Battles were won, ground was taken, yet the enemy returned stronger than before. And as American forces refined their coordination and multiplied their presence, the judgment that the Sherman was merely a poor tank began to collide with an uncomfortable reality. It was not going away. By 1944, the war had become a matter of production curves and replacement tables. The United States produced tens of thousands of M4 Shermans. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and beyond worked around the clock. Damage reports were analyzed, design changes implemented, and improvements standardized across production runs. A tank lost in Normandy could be replaced by one shipped weeks earlier, already en route across the Atlantic. Germany could not match this pace. Allied bombing disrupted factories. Skilled labor grew scarce. Raw materials were limited. Each Panther or Tiger represented a significant investment of time and resources. Losses accumulated faster than replacements could be built. German generals understood this in theory. On the battlefield, they felt it in practice. Units that began campaigns at full strength dwindled. Companies shrank to platoons. Platoons disappeared entirely. Logistics angle. Fighting the war behind the front. American logistics were not glamorous, but they were relentless. Fuel flowed forward in pipelines and convoys. Recovery vehicles followed armored units, pulling damaged Shermans back for repair. Spare parts were abundant. Crews expected their tanks to be fixed or replaced. German logistics were fragile. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks more often than enemy fire. Recovery under air superiority was dangerous, sometimes impossible. Damaged vehicles were frequently abandoned and destroyed by their own crews. A Panther lost to a mechanical failure was just as gone as one destroyed by enemy action. The Sherman's greatest strength was not its gun or armor, but its place in a system designed to keep fighting tomorrow. Moral and psychological angle. When numbers break confidence. For German crews, the psychological impact was profound. Early in the war, seeing enemy tanks was an event. By 1944, it was a constant. Shermans appeared in waves. Losses inflicted one day were erased the next. Tactical victories felt hollow. German soldiers began to speak of being overwhelmed, not by skill, but by inevitability. No matter how many Shermans burned, more arrived. Air power followed them. Artillery followed them. Infantry followed them. The sense of mastery that had defined the Panzer arm began to erode. Confidence gave way to fatigue. Fatigue gave way to resignation. What German commanders had dismissed as industrial clumsiness was revealing itself as strategic endurance. And it was in Normandy, amid the hedgerows and narrow lanes, that this endurance would be tested to its limit, forcing a final reckoning between quality and quantity, precision and persistence. By the summer of 1944, the argument was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding field by field. hedgerow by hedgerow, across the narrow lanes of Normandy. The Allied landings on June 6th did not immediately unleash armored warfare on a grand scale. For weeks, the terrain itself restrained movement. Thick bocage hedgerows turned open countryside into a maze of natural fortifications. Visibility was limited. Engagements were sudden and violent. German defensive doctrine, ambush, concealment, disciplined fire, was well suited to this environment. In these early battles, German tanks performed exactly as expected. Panthers and Tigers dominated long sight lines when they could find them. Even Panzer IVs, handled by experienced crews, knocked out Shermans with efficiency. American after-action reports recorded heavy losses. Tank crews learned quickly that frontal engagements were often fatal. Burning Shermans became a grimly familiar sight. From a purely tactical perspective, German commanders could point to success. But tactics were no longer the center of gravity. Every day, more Shermans rolled off landing craft and temporary ports. Damaged tanks were recovered, repaired, and returned. Crews replaced losses with unsettling speed. American engineers modified tanks in the field, welding improvised hedgerow cutters to hulls to restore mobility. Artillery coordination tightened. Infantry-tank cooperation improved through bitter experience. The learning curve was steep, and it favored the side that could afford to learn. German units, by contrast, were locked into diminishing returns. Each Panther lost reduced not just combat power, but flexibility. Replacement vehicles arrived late, if at all. Fuel shortages forced commanders to choose which units could move and which would wait. Air superiority made daylight movement perilous. By late June, German armored reserves were being committed piecemeal, rushed into battle to plug gaps rather than shape operations. This was not how blitzkrieg was meant to be fought. The illusion that tank warfare was a contest of champions, one superior machine defeating another, was dissolving. In its place was a grinding reality. Tanks were becoming expendable components in a much larger mechanism. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered what remained of German operational coherence in Normandy. Massive aerial bombardment tore open defensive lines. Shermans surged forward through breaches widened by infantry and artillery. German armor fought back fiercely, but it was outnumbered, outflanked, and increasingly immobilized. Panthers scored kills. Tigers held crossroads. But each stand cost irreplaceable strength. What German generals had once mocked, America's reliance on numbers, was now compressing the battlefield, reducing room for maneuver, and suffocating tactical brilliance beneath sheer weight. Normandy was not the end of German armored resistance, but it was the moment when the outcome became irreversible. The realization was spreading through headquarters and field units alike. This war could no longer be won by fighting better. It would be lost by being unable to fight long enough. By the autumn of 1944, the pattern established in Normandy repeated itself with merciless consistency. German armored units still fought with skill. Panthers and Tigers still dominated individual engagements when terrain and fuel allowed. But those conditions were becoming rarer. The front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Everywhere, American and Allied armored columns pressed forward, not always faster, but always continuously. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 was Germany's last attempt to reverse the arithmetic. German planners believed that a concentrated armored strike, led by elite Panzer divisions, could rupture the Allied front, seize fuel depots, and force a negotiated peace in the West. On paper, it was a return to the principles that had once brought victory: surprise, mass, and decisive movement. At the tactical level, initial success followed. American units were caught off guard. Shermans were destroyed in ambushes. German crews once again experienced the brief, intoxicating sensation of superiority. But the conditions that had enabled blitzkrieg no longer existed. Fuel ran out faster than plans anticipated. Broken-down vehicles clogged narrow roads. Air superiority returned as weather cleared, turning retreat into destruction. Every German tank lost in the Ardennes was effectively gone forever. American losses were replaced. Shermans continued to arrive. Not just standard 75mm variants, but improved models with 76mm guns, better optics, and refined ammunition stowage. Tank destroyers, artillery, and air support filled gaps in direct firepower. American commanders absorbed losses and adapted tactics without halting the advance. German commanders began to acknowledge what had become undeniable. This was not a war of superior machines defeating inferior ones. It was a war of systems overwhelming systems that could no longer sustain themselves. The Sherman did not need to outfight the Panther. It needed to be present everywhere the Panther appeared, and then appear again after being destroyed. By early 1945, German armored formations existed largely on paper. Crews lacked tanks. Tanks lacked fuel. Fuel lacked transport. The Panzer arm, once the symbol of modern warfare, was bleeding away through attrition it could not escape. In private communications and later memoirs, German generals reflected on the imbalance they had underestimated. They had judged the Sherman by its armor and gun. They had not judged it by its ability to return, again and again, across continents and campaigns. The turning point was not a single battle. It was the moment German command realized that destruction no longer produced decision. And with that realization came the understanding that the war's outcome was no longer shaped by brilliance at the front, but by capacity far behind it. In factories, ports, and training grounds, an ocean away. What followed was not collapse in a single blow, but erosion, steady, irreversible, and final. When the fighting moved beyond Normandy and into the heart of Western Europe, the battlefield told a consistent story, one written in abandoned steel and empty fuel tanks. German armored losses mounted rapidly in late 1944 and early 1945. Panthers and Tigers lay disabled along roadsides, some destroyed by enemy fire, many more scuttled by their own crews after mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion. Workshops could no longer keep pace. Recovery vehicles were scarce. Air attacks made salvage operations deadly. What remained of Germany's armored strength was increasingly fragmented. Tank battalions that once fielded dozens of vehicles fought with a handful. Commanders spread armor thinly across wide fronts, hoping to delay rather than defeat the advance. Tactical excellence survived in pockets, but it no longer shaped outcomes. American forces, meanwhile, accepted losses as part of movement. Shermans were destroyed in large numbers, sometimes alarmingly so. But the formations they belonged to did not dissolve. Replacement tanks arrived. Crews were reassigned. Units continued forward with minimal interruption. The battlefield rhythm favored continuity, not preservation. This imbalance extended beyond machines. German tank crews were among the most skilled soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Their loss was catastrophic. Training new crews took time Germany no longer had. American crews, while also suffering casualties, benefited from a training and replacement system designed for scale. Experience accumulated across formations rather than disappearing with each destroyed vehicle. By early 1945, German commanders understood that armored warfare had slipped beyond their control. The Panzer arm could still fight, but it could no longer influence the war's direction. Holding ground became an exercise in delaying the inevitable. What had begun as mockery of American design had ended in strategic exhaustion. The Sherman did not dominate the battlefield through fear or technical brilliance. It dominated through presence, and as the front collapsed inward toward Germany's borders, the consequences of that presence would shape not only the war's end, but how it would later be remembered. When the war ended, the assessments began. German generals, now prisoners or civilians, wrote memoirs and studies analyzing their defeat. Many continued to criticize the Sherman as an inferior fighting vehicle. They pointed to its vulnerability, its high profile, and its losses in direct engagements. In isolation, these critiques were often accurate. But isolation was the mistake. Post-war analysis revealed what battlefield impressions had obscured. The Sherman's true strength lay not in winning duels, but in sustaining operations across continents. American armored divisions maintained momentum under conditions that would have halted German units entirely. Fuel, ammunition, replacements, and repairs flowed forward with consistency that German planners had never fully experienced. American reports, in turn, did not deny the Sherman's limitations. U.S. Army evaluations acknowledged the Panther and Tiger as formidable opponents. They also emphasized survivability, communication, and combined arms integration as decisive factors. The Sherman was treated not as a masterpiece, but as a component that worked as intended within a broader system. Over time, public memory simplified the story. The Sherman became either a death trap or a triumph of mass production, depending on perspective. What was often lost was the reality experienced by those who fought. A war where neither tank alone could decide outcomes. German generals had mocked American designs because they measured worth narrowly, through armor thickness and gun caliber. The war demonstrated a harsher truth. Victory belonged to the side that could fight today, recover tonight, and fight again tomorrow. In that sense, the Sherman was not a symbol of technical mediocrity. It was a symbol of strategic clarity. As Europe lay in ruins and armies disbanded, the lessons of armored warfare were already being written into new doctrines. Future conflicts would remember Normandy and the Ardennes not for which tank was best, but for how wars had become contests of endurance, organization, and will. Those lessons would echo long after the wreckage was cleared. The story of the Sherman is often told as a debate about steel, about guns, armor, and silhouettes on a battlefield. But that debate misses the deeper truth revealed between 1942 and 1945. Wars are not decided by machines in isolation. German generals mocked the Sherman because they judged it the way professionals judge tools, by precision, elegance, and technical superiority. In that framework, their criticism made sense. The Sherman was not refined. It was not dominant in a duel. It did not embody the engineering perfection the Panzer arm prized. What they underestimated was that modern war had moved beyond duels. The United States did not build the Sherman to be exceptional. It built it to be available. Available at beaches and ports. Available after breakdowns and losses. Available again after defeat. The tank was designed for a kind of warfare where endurance mattered more than brilliance, and continuity mattered more than survival of any single machine. German armored doctrine had been forged in short wars. Wars decided by speed and shock. The conflict that followed was something else entirely. It was global, industrial, and unforgiving. In that environment, even the finest weapon became irrelevant if it could not be sustained. The Sherman did not win because it was better. It won because it fit the world that produced it. By the time German commanders fully understood this, the realization came too late to change the outcome. Tactical excellence remained. Courage remained. Skill remained. What did not remain was the capacity to replace what was lost. In the end, the Sherman stands as a reminder that history is shaped less by perfection than by persistence. The tank that was mocked did not need to be admired. It only needed to keep moving. And in a war where movement never stopped, that proved to be enough.